the sad story of Stephen Wangondu, billionaire who hired hitmen to kill his son to take his son's wife. As Kenyans went home after enjoying 2021 New Year's parties at different spots in the country, for one young businessman from Nyeri County, Mr. Dan Mwangi, the trip back home was his last moments alive. Unaware of the danger that awaited him right outside his gate, Dan drove home right into the hands of killers contracted by his father, Stephen Wangondu. As he opened his gate, the goons stabbed him like Vikings and left him dead, right outside his gate and beside his car that was still on, waiting to enter his home. A scene that shook the sleepy town of Mweiga, which was still nursing the hangovers of an eventful night. You wonder how father and son got here. Well, here's the gist. Stephen Wangondu was a successful businessman who lived in Mweiga village in Nyeri County. His main business was agri-farming for export, whereby he owned fish farms and several tea and banana plantations. Farms that turned him into a billionaire after investing their profits into rental apartments and petrol stations. Stations which were strategically located at Matatu stages, one in Nyeri CBD and Mweiga CBD to ensure maximum profits. He also invested in the mining business, owning a stone-crushing plant in his hometown of Mweiga along the Nyeri-Nyahururu highway. His success made him irresistible to 80s baddies, and for a man with an insatiable sex drive, he married 3 beautiful Kikuyu queens who massaged his back in intervals. Beatrice Merle Wangondu, Scholastica Wangondu, and a third, Mwangi's mom. He lived with his wives at his mansion on his expansive 100-acre farm in Mweiga, where the good Lord blessed them with 9 kids, 4 boys and 5 girls. For easy mobility of his large family, he gifted his wives either a Range Rover or Land Rover, depending on their taste, which they used to carry out their errands while looking after his 9 kids. Kids who he took to the best schools in the country, while raising them with equal love despite being half-siblings. He took insurance covers for all of them, and occasionally dressed boys in suits like him. And as the adage goes, ugali comes from flour. One of his sons embraced Nyayoism and followed in his father's footsteps in agribusiness. That son was Dan Mwangi Wangondu. Dan Wangondu was a dog lover who had turned his love for dogs into a business. He bred and trained German Shepherds for sale, something he loved so much that he put his dogs as his FB profile picture. In addition, he assisted in managing his dad's businesses, something his father was really proud of, and supported him in his own ventures like Club Stesco Mweiga, which he opened. The club was on top of a bank. However, as he managed his father's businesses, he always clashed with his dad's confidant and driver, James Mahinda. Mahinda was his dad's right-hand man, who had access to finances and the power to decide who meets Wangondu, something that irked Dan. However, since God doesn't reside in Lagos, he gladly sent an angel his way to kill him with beauty and love, something Dan gladly accepted as he spent his everything courting this beautiful damsel. Her name, Frida Njeri. Love brewed, and they were blessed with 2 beautiful daughters, making Wangondu a grandfather. Thanks to these bundles of joy, he gifted Dan with 20 acres of land where Dan built his matrimonial home to raise his family with Frida. However, what Dan didn't know is that just like you and me, bro, who are looking at this babe like, damn, she can Garrett, his papa was also seeing his daughter-in-law like that. As the days went by, the two got into frequent problems like normal couples. Some they worked on like D Major's song, but some left them more separated than ever before. A separation like Tokodi and Ekarapa where you live separately. And a separation that revealed the true colors of his dad, who without shame moved in with his daughter-in-law and set up a business for her. Something that really disturbed Dan. Up to a point where Dan was drinking every day, trying to figure out what was going on, because this was like a bad dream. Deep in angst, he resorted to confront his dad like a man, a confrontation that turned violent. On the 1st of Des 2020, he confronted his dad in public at his Mweiga petrol station and angrily asked him, "Why are you hosting my ex?" Shocked by the question and mannerisms of his son, Wangondu tried to mumble his way out of the public confrontation, but it was at this moment he knew he had messed up. Just like MP Salasya, Dan landed a heavy slap on his dad's aged cheek. Pa! A slap so hard that Wangondu angrily picked up the phone and called his driver, her right-hand man, Elijah Mahinda, and told him, "I have 160K, find a team." I want that boy dead." Calling his driver, asking him to get a team to execute his son, the driver was hesitant. He shared his concerns with Wangondu, who roped him into an amazing plan. Wangondu told Mahinda to lie that he's looking for people to come discipline errant employees at his stone-crushing plant in Mweiga. That way, they'd get people whom they'd convince after. On hearing this, Mahinda was convinced since the success of the plan meant taking out his biggest rival in the management of Wangondu's businesses. Moreover, he had also been promised vast land as a reward for his efforts. On 29 December 2020, Mahinda reached out to his friend Jeffrey Waratumo, who owned a Mirage shop in Embu town. He told him he was looking for casual laborers. The next day, Mahinda traveled to Embu after receiving 20,000 shillings from Wangondu to pressure Jeffrey, who later called Mr. Eddie Ngari, who was a frequent customer at his Muguka base. Eddie had told him to link him up with job opportunities. A few moments later, Eddie showed up at the Muguka base and met Mahinda, who asked him if he could get another person. As if on cue, Eddie referred his buddy Rafael Wachira, and the team was now complete. Mahinda enlightened them about the real plan, which the pay was a meager 100,000 shillings, since he was to keep the 60,000 as commission. A figure that would confuse any hopeless guy the way it did Eddie and Rafael as they accepted the murder plot. The next day, the trio boarded a matatu from Embu to Nyeri, a distance of 78 kilometers. On arrival, they enjoyed some nice nyamchom at a popular restaurant in town as they finalized their plan. The plan to discipline Dan. After lunch, the trio proceeded to Mweiga town via matatu and picked a boda that took them to Dan Mwangi's home. The purpose was for Eddie and Rafael to identify the location. Afterwards, they went back to Mweiga town where Mahinda showed them Dan, who was happy as a lark being the 31st. Having seen him, Mahinda bought them gloves and a metal rod for the job. In addition, he gave them each 500 shillings to spend in the small town as they waited for the 11th hour to ambush Dan. They parted ways, and Mahinda went to Mwangandu's stone-crushing plant to meet the boss. He updated Mwangandu of the plan, which lit up the tycoon's mood. He then drove Mwangandu home so that he'd be left with the boss's car that'd be used as a getaway vehicle. Perfect plan. Oblivious of the danger that awaited him, Dan enjoyed the night in his usual spots. From 019 in Nyeri town to Club Tent in his hometown Mweiga. He partied like any other life-loving Kenyan. Whereas Eddie and Rafael were hot on his trail, and after losing him for a minute, they resorted to waiting for him at his gate. They took a boda that dropped them outside his home, where they hid in the bush waiting to ambush Dan. As dawn approached and party levels decreased, a tired Dan drove home. His final drive on Earth. He arrived, alighted the car to open his gate, and it was then that he was ambushed. The two killers hit him several times with the metal rod and stabbed him countless times, leaving him in a pool of blood. There and then, the joyful Dan Mwangi left planet Earth in the dawn of 1st January 2021. At exactly 5:30, the two murderers called Mahinda asking for payment for a job well done. Mahinda hurriedly met the duo at Mweiga town and drove them to a safe hiding spot in Kamatongu Hill as he processed their payment. After dropping them at Kamatongu Hill, Mahinda drove back to Wendiga to his boss's house, who was happy on receiving the news. He gave Mahinda 160,000 shillings and got into character to avoid being suspected. Mahinda drove back to Kamatongu, where he granted the duo the 100,000 shillings, which they happily took, and took them to Nyeri town where they left for Embu. With the money, Eddie built a 2-roomed house, whereas Rafael spent the money buying expensive stuff like a subwoofer and drinks at his local joint. After Mahinda parted ways with the murderous duo who left for Embu, he drove back to Mweiga. He was scared, yes, but only the reward of land promised by Wangondu gave him strength. By this time, news of Dan's death were spreading like bushfire, and the town of Mweiga was clouded by sadness. In a news interview, they said it was unbelievable how a man they had seen a few hours ago was now dead. Social media was also ablaze. Friends who knew him poured out their love, shock, and disappointment in the murder of as they sought justice via justice for Dan. What puzzled them most was the motive, something the DCI detectives who responded to the call picked up as they meticulously examined and documented the crime scene. As they looked for prints, they wondered. since nothing had been stolen from the young businessman's home, and interestingly, not even his phone, cash, or his Volkswagen GT was stolen from him. The murderers took nothing. Very sus. Meanwhile, as if applying for an Oscar award, Wangondu was at his mansion receiving messages of condolence from friends and family, acting all bereaved. To him, it was just a passing cloud. On 5th of January 2021, friends and relatives of Dan held a candle vigil to celebrate the short life of the young businessman. To them, he'd forever be remembered. And on 6th of January 2021, Dan Mwangi Wangondu was buried at his home in Mweiga village, a burial attended by hundreds who pressured sleuths to act fast in apprehending the thugs. 2 weeks after the burial, Mahinda started pursuing his acres of land prize for a job well done. Wangondu promised to reward him, but first, he had another plan in mind. The plan to seek payment for the life insurance plan he had covered Dan Wangondu. So he frequently asked Mahinda to drive him to the regional commander's office and insurance company to seek and present the post-mortem results needed to process payment. The visits to the regional commander's office is what set the sleuths on his ass. How could a man be that fast in processing payment of his dead son? They wondered as they opened his file, only to realize that in 1995, he had been paid for the death of his son, a Form 3 student at Giakanja High School, who had drowned mysteriously while on holiday at a dam in his farm. Now everything started to align, and detectives dug deep into Wangondu's life. Meanwhile in Embu, Eddie and Raphael visited their destiny connector, Mr. Jeffrey Warutumo, at his Muguka baz, who wondered why they didn't pay him a commission for the connection. The duo told him they had given cash 8K to Mahinda to send him. And it was at this moment, Jeffrey Warutumo called Mahinda in Mweiga seeking the cash 8K. Mahinda sent him the cash and asked Jeffrey to tell the duo to switch off their phones. Shit was hitting the fan, cause the cops were hot on their heels. Sensing the danger approaching, Mahinda relocated to Githurai 45 to hide. Here in the midst of thousands, he felt undetectable. But sadly, the determination of sleuths who were now watching their every move was unfaltering, and as soon as they noticed Magondu's driver was missing, they knew STH was off and started tracking him. On February 20th, sleuths tracked Mahinda at his hiding spot in Githurai, and after massaging his balls, the young driver snitched harder than Mike Sonko, leading the detectives to his acquaintances in Madakani area of Embu County. The four goons were driven to Nyeri to be presented to court, and upon further interrogation at the Nyeri cells, they revealed it was all Wangondu's plan. On 24th of February 2021, Wangondu was arrested. The news of his arrest angered the town of Mweiga, who held demos the next day seeking justice for Dan, while wishing the cops had allowed them to deal with Wangondu instead arresting him. The 5 suspects were arraigned in court and remanded at King Ongo prison, but since they were innocent until proven guilty, they were released on a Cash 1M bond on April 28th, as they waited for their first mention on May 10th. During that period, Wangondu was admitted at Outspan Hospital with COVID-19 complications, which he succumbed to on May 7th, 3 days before he could stand trial for his son's murder. He died aged 74 years. The news of his death was satisfying to many quotas who cursed the old man for orchestrating his son's murder, wishing he doesn't rest in peace but eternal shame. However, his burial was so controversial, with residents saying the man's not dead and only faked death to escape justice. Surprisingly, even in his burial, only his family was allowed to enter the gate, and no one saw the body nor eulogy. Something that gives life to the rumors the billionaire is still alive. Meanwhile, what do you think? Is the guy still alive or dead?